I recently had the pleasure of sitting down with Jules Evans to talk about his book, Philosophy for Life and Other Dangerous Situations. I hope you'll enjoy the interview. How did philosophy help you overcome social anxiety?
I came to ancient Greek philosophy through a type of therapy called cognitive behavioral therapy, which helped me. I'd suffered from social anxiety and post-traumatic stress for about 6 years, 6 miserable years from about 18 to 24. CBT helped me quite quickly to overcome things like panic attacks and general anxiety. I then went and interviewed the people who'd invented CBT, two American psychologists called Albert Ellis and Aaron Beck. And they told me that the main inspiration for CBT was ancient Greek philosophy, and particularly Stoicism. So through that, in my 20s, I really dived into the world of ancient Greek philosophy and discovered how incredibly accessible and therapeutic it still is.
And can you expound on that a little bit more? What exactly did CBT take from ancient philosophy?
Mm-hmm. So the main thing is the idea, which comes from a quote from a Stoic philosopher called Epictetus, which is that people are disturbed not by events, but by their opinion about events. So the Stoics, like Buddhists, say that emotions contain judgments. They're not just automatic physical reactions. They contain a certain interpretation of what's happening to you. So our mind is constantly making these snap, automatic, slightly subconscious judgments. This is bad, that's terrible, this is frightening. And those judgments guide our emotional and physiological reactions. So when you're aware of how your judgments and your perspective on things affects your emotions, then you can look at those automatic judgments and say, is that definitely true? Is that wise? Is there a different way I could look at this? So asking yourself those kind of questions is called the Socratic method in CBT. So that comes from Greek philosophy. So basically, you can then learn to change your habitual story about yourself and about the world, your habitual perspective on things, by training yourself to kind of look at things differently and to respond differently. So using that kind of method, which comes from Stoicism, you can change even chronic, deep-seated personality habits like, habitual social anxiety.
Can you give us an example from the book of someone who has used the methodologies that you're describing?
Mm-hmm. So one of the people I interview in the book, I wanted to go and find ordinary people who've used the ideas and practice of ancient Greek philosophies in their lives. So I wasn't just looking at experts or academics, but people who've used it in their lives. Like for the ancient Greeks and Romans, philosophy was not something you just studied in the lecture room, it was something you practiced in your everyday life. So over several years, I tracked down all kinds of different people who consciously used Greek philosophies in their life, like former gangsters, astronauts, soldiers, politicians, and told their stories. So one, for example, was a lady called Rhonda Cornum. She was a soldier, a medic in the US Army, and she was captured in the first Iraq War. She was the first ever female prisoner of war in the history of the US military. And she was prisoner of war is obviously potentially an incredibly traumatic situation. She was assaulted by Iraqi soldiers. She was everything about her external situation was controlled by her captors, and yet she discovered a kind of technique for resilience, which comes from Stoicism, which is when you're in a potentially traumatic situation, don't fixate over the things beyond your control, but instead focus on what is in your control, which is your beliefs. So that was a technique developed by this Stoic philosopher Epictetus, who was a slave in the Roman Empire. Again, potentially an incredibly disempowering, traumatic situation. And he teaches his students to always remember some things are in our control and other things are out of our control, and to concentrate on this kind of inner freedom. So she used that technique to not be traumatized by that situation. She was then finally released And she went on to become a brigadier general in the army and to head up a resilience training program for the entire military. So this was introduced about a decade ago. It was a $200 million resilience program to try and teach all soldiers and their families these kind of basic methods for thinking resiliently, which actually come from ancient Greek philosophy.
Let's talk about the revival of Stoicism. What does that look like? What have you experienced?
So when I started to get interested in Stoicism and to write about it, let's say in about 2010, there were not that many people interested in Stoicism. So I helped organize the first gathering of modern Stoics in San Diego in 2010, and there were like 12 people there. And we still managed to fall out with each other. There was a kind of schism in early Stoicism because some of them were very atheist and some of them were very religious. But anyway, since this book's come out and some other books on modern Stoicism, there's definitely been a revival. It's become much more often. You see articles about Stoicism all the time. I helped to work in a project called Modern Stoicism, which kind of hooked together psychologists and classicists and philosophers. We launched this online program called Live Like a Stoic for a week, where you could follow an online course, which thousands of people did. And we started to organize an annual Stoic conference called Stoicon, which has been in London, then it was in New York, then it was in Toronto. So yeah, now there's thousands of people into Stoicism, and if you type Stoicism to Google News, you get articles all the time. It's particularly big in Silicon Valley. You can imagine like a kind of rational philosophy that's very, very logical, really appeals to, and it can be quite self-reliant and a bit libertarian. That really appeals to kind of Silicon Valley people. So a lot of Silicon Valley people, like Tim Ferriss, for example, use Stoicism as a kind of life hack, and also particularly as a way of coping with fear of failure. So for entrepreneurs who are constantly like, things might either take off or they might fall apart, that's a very anxious kind of lifestyle. So they find Stoicism useful as a way of, again, thinking about what's the worst that can happen, can I survive even if I'm not a millionaire or something like that. So they find that, so it's been very helpful in Silicon Valley. And it's also been popular in sports. So, for example, the Seattle Seahawks. I don't follow American football, but I believe they've been very successful the last few years. So they use Stoic ideas over the last few seasons. Things like focus on the little things, things like getting into good habits, not just focusing on external success, but on kind of inner values to stay strong. I've been the kind of in-house philosopher for a rugby team in the UK called Saracens, who are like the national champions over the last 3 years. And we've run like a philosophy club, if you can imagine, with like these enormous kind of rugby players, many, like a lot of them who played for England. And we every few months talk about different philosophical ideas, how they can use them in their lives and on the pitch and so on. So there's been a revival of ancient philosophy in sports as well. So just in general, it's been quite a revival, and it's interesting for me to see how Stoicism mutates as it becomes popular, in good ways and sometimes slightly weird ways as well. Because it's a bit like with mindfulness, you see it, becoming a business, and also becoming a bit of a kind of like, hey, how you can use Stoicism to become a better investor, or this kind of thing. It becomes part of the capitalist market in a way. But in general, I'm really pleased, because I think, for let's say for 2,000 years, you have this incredible tradition of practical ideas and techniques which were so therapeutic, and they were forgotten for a long time. They were considered just part of ancient history. So I'm, in general, very happy that people have rediscovered ancient Greek philosophy and seen that it's just as useful and practical and therapeutic as, say, Buddhism.
What do you most hope that readers will take away from Philosophy for Life and Other Dangerous Situations?
I hope they take away two things. The first is just a reacquaintance with this part of Western culture, which is at the root of so much of our culture, but was kind of forgotten. And a realization this is not some scary, very specialized, inaccessible aspect of our culture, but incredibly accessible and incredibly useful. So that's one thing, that they come across these names like Socrates and Cicero and Marcus Aurelius and get to know them and befriend them and realize these are allies that they can go back to in their life. And then the second thing is just, I hope it helps people if they're in difficult times, or if they've got a relative or a friend who's in difficult times. Like, this book contains ideas which massively helped me in the kind of tricky period of my life. They're not my ideas, they're ideas that have been road tested for centuries. And I constantly get emails from people who say this book also really helped them, like when they got diagnosed with cancer or had a bereavement or lost their job, in one of those things. And those are the best emails that I ever get. I love them. And I don't feel arrogant about it because I know these are not my ideas. I'm just passing them on. That's what I hope. I know that this book is very helpful for people because it's exactly what helped me too.